My goal right now is to act like some nice Mexican coffee to give you a little bit of energy as we talk about our digital future and the world in which we live. I'm a professor at UCLA, and I have to tell you that Mexico, outside of maybe India, is my favorite country in the world. I got married here. And I also want to invite you during this talk to engage with me via Twitter. I actually really love to engage with my students and actually the larger public. I do a lot of mainstream media outreach these days. So, without further ado, that is my Twitter handle, and I wanted to thank Andres Romer for the kind invitation here. Thank you so much, mucho gusto. And also his wonderful staff, who's made my wife and myself feel absolutely wonderful while we're here. Okay. So these are the 3 books that I have written. The third is about to be released, and I'm going to give you a sneak preview of some of the ideas that are in that book. And in particular, what I want us to do is really think about the internet. All of us have memories that are quite early about the internet, right? How many of you in this room remember the idea of surfing the internet? Surfeando. All right, you remember that. How many of you today use the expression of surfing to describe your experience of the internet today? Almost no one, right? Almost nobody. So what is it that's happened, and how can we sort of not necessarily go back to surfing, but understand what was important about that experience of serendipity, of discovery, of browsing, of finding new information in ways that we felt we had power over? How do we get to that point? And what are the major issues that are engaging with this? So I'm going to give you a bunch of examples. I am sad to say that some of them are a bit critical and negative, but they are all intended to give us the inspiration and the hope to ensure that we really ensure that we have a digital future that is inclusive of all of us across the planet, inclusive of people of indigenous descent, inclusive of people from the working classes, inclusive of those of us who might lose our jobs in relation to automation, inclusive of all of us who believe in the ideals of democracy. I'm headed to President Fox's ranch to speak about this in literally 2 days. So I'm excited to give you some of my thoughts now and to get your feedback. All right, fantastic. We are at an incredible moment right now in the world, and in some ways it's very wonderful, in some ways it's really problematic. The top 7 people in our world have as much wealth as the bottom half, 3.5 billion people in our world. And 2 of the biggest tech companies in our world have acquired a valuation of over $1 trillion US, which is a number that has never been surpassed by hardly any company in the history of the world. And I'm speaking about Amazon and Apple here. So, do you all remember, right, that moment when the internet felt a bit like the Wild West, like we were cowboys kind of on the frontier, right? We were kind of exploring the world. And that's a line I'm going to say for President Fox, because he loves to be a cowboy. But what happened is, as all of us gained access to the internet across the world, and we all started to create our own web pages, our own blogs, our own content, our own news forums, we started to realize there is so much out there that we don't know how to find information that's meaningful for us, how to extract the signal from the noise, right? So what ended up happening is we began to turn to a couple different websites, and I think you know them all, right? Like Facebook and Google and Airbnb and Amazon, and these are what we call intermediaries. They are in the middle between us and one another. And not necessarily problematically. They are efficient sites, they produce valuable services. Google in particular, I gave a talk recently at Google with some criticism. They've created absolutely wonderful technologies. I'm writing my latest book on Google Drive, right? But what has happened transactionally as we all turned to these websites is we made a few people and their investors the greatest amounts of money that have ever been made in the history of the world while realizing that this is disrupting, not always in positive ways, many other aspects of our lives. Now let me give you a very simple example of this. Instagram. How many of you use Instagram? That's a lot of people. Instagram is owned by Facebook. It was sold to Facebook for a little over $1 billion, and it had 14 employees, average age of 27, and that was within 3 months of when Kodak, how many of you know Kodak, right? Which was a powerful digital imaging company and an imaging company, period, with many, many patents, went bankrupt. Kodak had about 40,000 employees, and they all lost their jobs, while 14 people became billionaires, or hundreds of millionaires, right? And so transactionally, on a macroeconomic level, that is a certain sign, it's a harbinger. This is not to demean or put down the incredible value of Instagram. It's really fun to use, and it's really eye-opening in a lot of ways, right? But it means that we're entering a society that might be generative digitally of greater amounts of inequality unless we do something about it. Now let me give you an example of this. How many of you take Ubers? Like almost everyone, right? That many people. Some people. And when you take an Uber, right, the drivers for Uber are not actually securely employed by Uber. They are what we call independent contractors. And Uber itself is not a taxi company, even though in a sense it's the biggest taxi company in the history of the world. When you pay money to Uber, you pay to Uber Technologies, right? So what that actually means is you can make a great amount of money and have a great amount of political and social power in the digital world by owning almost nothing and hiring almost nobody, right? So when I stay in an Airbnb in Coyoacán, which I've done many times, I love Coyoacán, right here, and I stay in an Airbnb in Coyoacán, who am I renting the place from? Well, I'm renting it from a person and they're getting some money, but transactionally, Airbnb is making an incredible amount of money by simply being the place to connect us, right? And that adds value, but how much of that value is extractive versus inclusive? So I think this is a very important issue that we need to look at, and that is a symbol of Alibaba there, the Chinese tech company. And I've interviewed Jack Ma for my new book, but we can actually replace that also with Jeff Bezos and Amazon. And Jeff Bezos has recently been stated to be the richest man in the history of the world. So we're at a very interesting moment, and actually in particular, Google, and I just mentioned that I spoke at Google, Google calls itself an AI company, artificial intelligence. And so I'm a former engineer and an artificial intelligence developer. I did my graduate work at MIT and my undergraduate work at Stanford as an engineer. And when I was building AI systems, everybody kind of laughed. This is how old I am, right? Because AI was seen as sort of science fiction, or are we talking about Terminator, are we talking about Minority Report, etc., right? But actually, in reality, AI has become a real reality, And this is for 3 reasons. One is we have exponentially increased computational power, 1. 2, per price point. 2 is we've exponentially increased storage power per price. And 3 is because all of us have this in our pockets. Right? Which means we're always providing data to faster and cheaper machines that can compute and store ever quicker than ever. The problem, though, is as we build intelligent machine learning systems, they might reflect and neutralize and make normal and mainstream the biases and inequalities of our world today. And this is just a simple example of that. Our very handsome former president of the United States, unlike the current one. That's just a joke. And he was, so there was a website, right? An application developed by a company called Face App, which is from St. Petersburg. Some of you might have heard about this. It's very similar to Hot or Not, which Mark Zuckerberg developed before Facebook. And what Face App would do is take people's faces on the internet and make them look more beautiful. And it turns Obama's face more white. And why is that happening? For 3 reasons. One is what technologies we end up creating that are supposed to be AI technologies depend on who creates them, right? Like if I'm going to create a technology that is supposed to order or structure or organize the world, obviously I'm going to create it based on how I view the world. That's one. Two is AI systems are machine learning systems. They learn from the data that's out there, that's out on the internet. And one thing we know is that our world is not yet as equal as it could be or should be, right? We're having major issues in the United States right now in relation to women's issues, right? With our Supreme Court justice, right now. But this is also true for minorities, people of Latin American descent, people of African American descent. These biases are based on theories of what we call implicit bias, which is a finding in the cognitive sciences that has been more or less proven to be true in a number of different controlled studies. Right? So one is who builds it, two is what it learns from, and three is these systems are being embedded everywhere we can possibly imagine, and we're not even sure where that's happening. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. So the systems are not audited, meaning I get to see what's going on and kind of interrupt the process and kind of converse and communicate with systems, then they can end up creating a world that is actually more unequal. And so this is not me being negative, it's me saying we have an opportunity to do better. Okay, I want to give you several examples of this. I'll make this quick, and then I'll go to the global level in this talk, because I got 33 minutes. No problem. So, Google had an issue that came up several months ago, where some pictures of African American, of black people in the United States, its image recognition systems was unable to tell the distinction between these pictures of black people and gorillas. And so, you know, there are problems. There are always false positives that occur with AI and machine learning systems. I wouldn't argue that they are the norm. Often they're the exception, but we need to pay attention to the exceptions so we can learn from them and create better technology, right? And so how did Google, that's the most telling part, respond to this issue? And I talked to them directly about this, is they removed gorillas from their image recognition corpus, right? So that means you're not actually interrupting or intervening within the very systems that are creating these forms of bias. Now this is more serious because we're starting to embed machine learning and AI systems in our institutions in the United States, and I would imagine some of this is happening here in Mexico and even in DF. I'll give you a simple example of this. So this is a project called Compass. It's a system that's being used right now in courtrooms. And in courts, you know, when you are on trial and you're found to be guilty or innocent, the judge makes a decision on how many years of prison you might get or how much of a fine you might pay. And part of that decision is made based on the judge's guess on the likelihood that you might commit a future crime. Remember that term, Future Crimes Institute from Minority Report? You all saw that movie?
Yes.
Right? Tom Cruise? All right. So, we are building Future Crimes Institutes technologically with systems like Compass. The problem is those systems, again, are reinforcing the biases of our world. It turns out, with this African American man on the left side and this Caucasian man on the right side, the African American man, even if he didn't actually ever commit a felony or a crime prior to this decision, the system and the Caucasian man did. It turns out that the system judges him as having a much higher likelihood of committing a future crime, which means the sentence he will get from the court will be much worse. Do you all follow what I'm saying here? Right? And why is that? Well, you could say, well, the system is racist or it's biased or whatever. No, it's far more implicit than that. The system is based on survey data that it asks these two individuals, and it actually asks them questions that are not directly about race. It asks them questions like, how often did one of your parents get in a fight in school? Or was one relative of yours placed in jail? And it turns out in the United States, far greater numbers of minorities have had these problems than Caucasian people. So these are what we call correlated data, right? So it's some information that might be environmental that could be linked to the system that then makes decisions about your life. It's structuring your future. So we're building digital futures in ways that are not transparent to us. one judge actually came out and said, you could have molested a child every day of your life and come out from this system as being low risk. And it turns out with this system that African Americans are predicted by this system, independent of whether they have a prior conviction, right, as having 77% higher chance of committing a violent crime. So, you know, sometimes I get in these conversations with people and people are, you know, and folks are saying, well, wait a second, these systems, you know, it's a process, we're making them better and better, and I completely agree with that. But then I also get the response when I raise these perspectives that, well, judges and people have racial bias. As people, we always have biases based on who we are. And I also have biases as a human being. And this is better than a racist judge or a judge who is against women or against Latino people, etc., right? But that's not the right question. The correct question should be not whether this is better than something that's already terrible. The question should be, what kind of digital world do we want to live in? And how do we ensure it's fair and equitable and balanced? So, in Los Angeles, where I live, I'm a professor at UCLA, as I mentioned. 1/3 of our Los Angeles Police Department precincts, meaning like offices, are using a machine learning system right now that's called predictive policing, PredPol. In 2 days, actually 2 days I'm going to President Fox's ranch, but in 4 days I'm going to be speaking in New York City on a panel with Eric Holder, who was the former Attorney General under President Obama, discussing this issue. And I'm writing about this in my new book. And what this system is doing is it collects data, what we call metadata, data about crime reports, and it's analyzing that data, and it's making a decision based on a machine learning system, what's called partially generative neural network system, just so you know the name. And it's making a decision based on that about whether the crime is a gang crime or not. And it turns out when something is considered to be a gang crime, it's treated in a much different way by the police and the courts and policymakers and civic institutions than if it's not. But the problem is this system is simply analyzing data rather than the interpretation of even the police officer of the crime report. And so obviously this has gotten some criticism, not just by people like me, but one of the authors of this project and who released a paper is an engineer, right? So this is engineers who are trying to intervene into other aspects of society for business purposes. And one of the engineers, his name is Hao Chan, this was an article that was in The Guardian actually, when he was asked, you know, like, hey, couldn't this have biases? Shouldn't we be very careful about what we call gang or not? Shouldn't we intervene as humans to understand how these systems are making these decisions? He said, I'm just an engineer. But the problem is you can't just be an engineer if you're building systems that are going to determine the future in all of these different manners, right? You just can't do that. And I don't blame him for saying that, right? Like in a lot of my part of my life, in many parts of my life, I was just an engineer, and I am just an engineer. But to me, this means that we have to change the nature of our educational and employment institutions and create new jobs for people who can work with these kinds of technologies, right? Because a lot of jobs, we're estimating 30 to 40%, might be automated in the near future, in the next 20, 30 years. So let's think creatively, let's think humanistically, let's think in ways that are inclusive. All right, so now I'm going to bring up Mr. Bezos. So this is a system that Amazon has developed, which we call recognition, and what this system is actually doing is it's being connected, it's a cloud-based facial recognition system. If you all aren't aware of this, facial recognition technology is being embedded in almost every technological platform imaginable. Facebook has invested heavily in facial recognition technology, and Amazon has as well. But what Amazon is doing is it's selling this technology to folks who work in the police, folks in the military, etc. So it means if you go to a protest or something like that, or if you go to a group meeting, I could simply have this technology connected to a camera. Maybe it's a camera connected to my body, if I'm a police officer, and I could go like this, maybe even more. And I could, within seconds, be able to tell the identity of every single one of you that's here in this room. That's point one. But point two is it's not just being able to determine your identity, it's looking at your file, right? Your history, because it's built into a database. So it might say it recognizes this guy, Ramesh Srinivasan, when he's 40 years old, doing this and this and this, but it can connect it to stuff it identified me around when I was 18 years old. And I'd like to say that I'm different right now than I was when I was 18 years old. My wife may not agree with that, but I am 40 and not 18. The problem here is that, again, like all the other examples I've provided, there are false positives that occur. And it turns out that this system misidentified 28 members of the United States Congress as criminals based on cross-referencing facial information from databases of police mugshots.